The Viet Cong squad heard it before they saw it. A low, circling drone completely unlike the fast, brief pass of a fighter jet. Every man froze. Nobody raised a weapon. Nobody so much as adjusted a firing position, even though the aircraft crawling across the night sky above them, by any normal military logic, looked like an easy, slow-moving target. Captured documents recovered later from Viet Cong units explained exactly why. Standing orders, distributed down to squad level, told every soldier to hold fire specifically against this aircraft, warned that conventional weapons were effectively useless against it, and cautioned that shooting at it would only, in the words of the translated directive itself, infuriate the dragon. An entire army had been ordered to sit still and take it rather than risk drawing its full attention. To understand how a 20-year-old cargo plane earned an order like that from an enemy who rarely showed that kind of caution toward anything American forces flew, we have to go back to a rejected idea that had already failed 4 separate times before Vietnam gave it one final chance. The concept behind what would eventually terrify Viet Cong units enough to order their own soldiers not to shoot back was almost 40 years old by the time it reached South Vietnam. In 1926, First Lieutenant Fred Nelson strapped a .30 caliber machine gun to a DH-4 biplane and proved that a fixed gun firing sideways from a banking aircraft, flying a tight circle around a single ground point, could keep continuous fire on target far longer than any conventional strafing run. The Army Air Corps watched the demonstration, filed the result, and did nothing with it. Lieutenant Colonel Gilmore MacDonald pitched the same lateral firing concept formally in 1942, again in 1945, again in 1947, and a fourth time in 1961. 4 separate proposals, 4 separate rejections, spread across nearly 2 decades and 3 different wars. Bell Aerosystems engineer Ralph Flexman wrote up a formal technical proposal in December 1962, and Air Force research psychologist Captain John Simons ran early pylon turn experiments in a T-28 trainer shortly afterward. The idea still had no institutional home, no funding, no champion senior enough to force it through Air Force leadership that remained skeptical of arming a slow, unarmored aircraft for mission fighter jets were supposedly already covering. Captain Ronald Terry changed that trajectory almost single-handedly. A former F-86 and F-100 fighter pilot who had just returned from a fact-finding tour of Vietnam in the summer of 1964, Terry had watched tactical jets scream past burning outposts too fast to identify targets and too briefly to matter, and came home convinced the Air Force already owned the solution, sitting rejected in a filing cabinet for the better part of 40 years. The event that finally forced institutional action arrived on October 31, 1964, when Viet Cong sappers mortared Bien Hoa Air Base, destroying or damaging dozens of American and South Vietnamese aircraft on the ground and killing and wounding American servicemen in a single, coordinated strike. General Curtis LeMay, confronted with a night attack American air power had done nothing to prevent, finally authorized Terry's project. Terry briefed LeMay directly in November 1964, reportedly spent some of his own money keeping the effort moving, and flew to Bien Hoa with 2 test crews and the equipment to convert a pair of C-47 cargo planes into something that had never existed in American service. His reception on arrival was openly hostile. Senior officers at Tan Son Nhut met Terry's team with armed air police and told them, according to Terry's own later account, that they weren't authorized to speak to anyone and would be on the next available flight back to the United States. Terry ignored the order. By December 11, 1964, the first armed FC-47 was flying combat missions. What Terry's team had built solved a problem American and South Vietnamese forces had lived with for years. Nightfall effectively neutralized every advantage conventional air power offered. Fighters couldn't loiter over a target for more than a few minutes before fuel forced them home. They couldn't reliably identify friendly positions in the dark without risking exactly the kind of accidental strike that made ground commanders reluctant to call them in at all. Helicopter gunships, still new to the war in 1964, rarely flew after dark, and burned through fuel reserves in under an hour. The only night option available before Terry's aircraft was the unarmed flare ship, slow transport planes dropping magnesium canisters that lit a battlefield for roughly 2.5 minutes before burning out, buying time for nothing but a brief look before darkness returned. Viet Cong units had learned to simply break contact and wait out those 2.5 minutes, resuming an assault the instant the flares died and the unarmed aircraft departed. That restraint order applied specifically to small arms fire from troops caught in the open, a very different calculation than the one North Vietnamese air defense planners eventually made along the Ho Chi Minh Trail itself. Once the gunship's mission expanded from defending isolated outposts to interdicting truck traffic along heavily defended stretches of the trail in Laos, North Vietnamese gunners there concentrated 37mm and 57mm anti-aircraft artillery, some radar-guided, specifically to counter the aircraft's predictable, low-altitude orbiting pattern. 6 aircraft were lost over the trail by August 1966 alone, forcing the Air Force to pull the type back from that specific mission and confirming that the same slow, circling flight profile that made the gunship so devastating against exposed infantry became a serious liability against anti-aircraft, weapons heavy enough to reach it. Ground troops, defending isolated firebases, came to rely on gunship support with an urgency that went beyond ordinary close air support requests. Radio calls for the aircraft, specifically, rather than for air support in general terms, became routine at outposts anywhere within its operational range, and commanders at besieged positions frequently credited its arrival with the specific moment a determined assault lost momentum and began to break apart. That reliance built over repeated engagements rather than any single dramatic mission, a pattern of night after night where the difference between an outpost, holding until dawn, and being overrun came down to whether the aircraft arrived in time and how long it could remain on station once it did. Terry's converted C-47 eliminated that waiting game entirely. 3 7.62mm General Electric miniguns, mounted to fire out the aircraft's left side, delivered a combined rate approaching 18,000 rounds a minute, roughly 300 rounds every single second. Flying a tight pylon turn at 3,000 feet in a 30-degree bank, the pilot kept a fixed gun sight locked on one point on the ground while the aircraft circled continuously, able to sustain fire for as long as ammunition and fuel allowed, rather than the few seconds a fighter's strafing run could manage. A 3-second burst placed a round in roughly every square yard across an area the size of a football field. 45 Mark 24 magnesium flares, 27 pounds each, let the same aircraft illuminate its own target, rather than depending on a second plane to do it. One airframe now did the job that had previously required 2 separate aircraft working in coordination, and it could keep doing that job for 7 or 8 hours on a single fuel load. A Stars and Stripes correspondent who watched an early mission described the aircraft's continuous stream of tracer fire as looking like dragons, breath pouring down from the sky, a phrase that reached the commanding officer of the unit flying the missions and stuck immediately. Puff, the magic dragon. The nickname spread through American units faster than any official Air Force designation ever could have, and it apparently reached Viet Cong intelligence channels just as quickly, since the captured directives recovered later used almost identical language, warning troops specifically about a dragon in the sky that conventional infantry weapons could not meaningfully threaten. This is exactly the kind of story this channel exists to dig up. The order and height enemy gave itself, not the other way around. If that's why you're still here, you already know what to do before the next one goes up. The order not to engage made tactical sense once the physics of the aircraft's firepower were understood from the receiving end. A rifle or light machine gun round fired up at a slow, low, seemingly vulnerable cargo plane offered exactly one outcome for the soldier who fired it, revealing his own position to an aircraft already carrying 18,000 rounds a minute and a fixed gun sight locked onto whatever muzzle flash appeared below. staying motionless and silent, however counterintuitive it felt while under fire from directly overhead, was statistically the safer choice, and Viet Cong commanders formalized that math into a standing order rather than leaving it to individual judgment in the panic of an actual engagement. The aircraft backed up that reputation with results that made the order easy to justify down the chain of command. On February 8, 1965, Captain Jack Harvey, part of Terry's original test cadre, orbited a Viet Cong battalion dug into a hilltop position in Binh Dinh province for 4 continuous hours, expending over 20,000 rounds. Roughly 300 Viet Cong soldiers died on that hilltop, with survivors reportedly dragging away another 150 wounded or dead before dawn. At the Duc Lap Special Forces camp in August 1968, a 4,000-strong North Vietnamese assault breached the outer wire within minutes of the opening barrage, and spooky gunships arrived within 45 minutes, flying continuous cover for days afterward and logging over 760,000 rounds fired into the attacking force before the camp held. Defenders at Duc Lap and elsewhere took to calling the aircraft overhead their guardian angel, a term that traveled through multiple firebases facing similar night assaults throughout the war. Not every mission ended without cost to the crews flying them. On February 24, 1969, a North Vietnamese mortar round struck the right wing of an AC-47 over Long Binh, tearing thousands of shrapnel holes through the fuselage and ripping a fully armed magnesium flare loose from an airman's hands mid-flight, its safety pin already removed. Airman First Class John Levitow, wounded by more than 40 pieces of shrapnel himself, dragged the burning flare the length of the cargo bay and threw it clear of the aircraft seconds before it would have ignited among 19,000 rounds of onboard ammunition, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor as the lowest-ranking airman ever to receive it. At a Shao Special Forces camp in March 1966, First Lieutenant Delbert Peterson, co-pilot of an AC-47 that crash-landed after both engines were shot out in poor weather, charged an enemy machine gun position alone to draw fire away from his surviving crew and was never seen alive again, receiving the Air Force Cross posthumously alongside his aircraft commander. The distinction between the two threats, small arms fire from the ground and heavy anti-aircraft artillery along the trail, mattered enormously to how North Vietnamese and Viet Cong commanders, across different sectors, actually approached the aircraft. A rifleman defending a hamlet or probing a firebase perimeter had no realistic way to bring down a gunship orbiting at 3,000 feet, and every attempt only marked his position for a fixed gun sight already tracking muzzle flashes. A dedicated anti-aircraft crew with a radar-guided 57mm gun dug in specifically to interdict a known flight corridor, faced an entirely different set of odds. The captured directive ordering restraint reflected the first reality, not the second. A targeted piece of doctrine written for infantry who had no answer rather than a blanket admission that the aircraft was invulnerable everywhere it flew. By the time newer gunship variants eventually replaced it, the aircraft that had started as a rejected 1926 idea revived 4 separate times over 4 decades had defended more than 3,900 positions across South Vietnam without ever losing one while it remained overhead. Captured Viet Cong instructions, telling soldiers to simply endure the dragon's attention rather than provoke it, stand as one of the rare documented cases in the entire war of an enemy force, formally ordering its own troops toward restraint rather than aggression, a testament less to any single feature of the aircraft's design than to the specific, patient math of 18,000 rounds a minute, circling continuously above anyone foolish enough to give away their position by firing back.